Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to session 4, whatever it is, of Develop Today. My name is Dewi. I'm from Cygames in Tokyo, and today I'm going to be talking about esports and a case study of a title that we're working on. And can I just get a quick raise of hands here, who actually works in esports? Yep, it's kind of what I was expected. So I'm going to try and keep it so that there's stuff in here that everybody can learn from. It's not going to be your typical, you should do esports because X, Y, Z. I'm going to try and take some examples of the way that we do esports in Japan that might be able to help give you some perspective on how Japanese companies like ours hyper-engage our users with our products. So here's my agenda for today. I'm sure none of you know who I am. Maybe hardly any of you know who Cygames are or the game that I work on, Shadowverse. Except for me, they're all pretty important things. So I'm going to try and at least persuade you of that before we get going. Then I'm going to look at how esports is in Japan compared to other countries out there before looking at some of the reasons why perhaps the scene there is different to how it is, not only in the West, but also in the rest of Asia. A little bit of talking about our title, Shadowverse, as a case study, and then just wrapping up at the end. Simple. So yes, my name is Dewi. It's a strange name, sorry about that. It's my parents' fault, and it's also their fault that I'm Welsh, so please forgive me. I moved to Japan after university. My first job was more than a decade ago back at Nanonsha. Not sure if you've heard of Nanonsha. They made Parappa the Rapper, Vib Ribbon, and a lot of other music games. It was very much a boutique game studio. There was only about 8 of us. And I was the producer of the title Haunt there, which was actually developed here in Brighton by Zoe Mode. Is anyone here from Zoe Mode today? Too bad, too bad. It was lots of fun working with those guys, but already that's about 7 years ago now. After that, I moved to New Zealand. I wanted to see what it was actually like working in Western game development, because I'd only worked in Japanese before, so I could see two sides of the fence. So I was in New Zealand working for Pickpock. I made a game called Giant Boulder of Death with Adult Swim, among others. Suggest you check it out. It's a bit like Katamari Damacy meets Temple Run, but with more awesome. And finally, I moved back to Japan. I missed it too much, and I ended up at Cygames, and I'm currently the director of Western operations for the hit title Shadowverse. Most of my responsibilities actually revolve around the esports and events programs in the West, but of course, that's probably not so much interest to you guys, so I'm going to talk about our activations in Japan specifically. It's kind of strange that in Japan, I'm perceived as an expert on the West. Here, I'm perceived as an expert on the East. I don't know what I'm an expert of, but I'm going to do my best, and hopefully you guys will learn something today. So taking a look, who are Cygames? So have you guys heard of Rage of Bahamut? Raise your hands if you have. Yeah, a good 75% of you. It was a pretty major title back when it came out in 2011, and really defined like what they call them social games in Japan, but they're basically browser games in the phone because they were still using feature phones back then, even though the iPhone had been out for several years. Extremely deep system of upgrading. It's an RPG. Gacha was all based in there. Even now, it's 6 years on, which is a long time in the smartphone industry. We're still in the top 200 grossing in Japan, so it's a lot of people love it. We even managed to get #1 grossing in the United States at one point, but not for too long. It was a big learning point for the company. A lot of people seem to think it was made by DNA, but actually they just published it. We were the developers. Back then, there was only a couple, maybe 2-3 dozen people at Cygames, but now there's over 1,500 of us, so there's been tremendous growth in that time. After Bahamut, a few years later, we came out with Grand Blue Fantasy. I'm not sure if you guys have heard of that, but if any of you have been to Japan, you've probably seen adverts for it all over the place. It's a massive, massive hit there. It's very much an old-school, turn-based RPG. Uses the same artist as Final Fantasy Tactics, I believe, who now is the director of one of our subsidiaries. And even now, it's going super, super strong. And if I could tell you the KPIs on this game, it would make your eyes bleed. But sadly, I can't talk about that today. But I'm going to talk a bit about Shadowverse, which has been out for a year now and actually came out just about the same time that I joined the company. I was so excited about it that I actually wanted to join Cygames. And it's not really a traditional smartphone game. It's more of a turn-based card game along the veins of Magic the Gathering, Hearthstone, Gwent, stuff like that. But with very much Cygames' stamp on it. And I'm going to be talking more about that later. So one of the few things that has got us any fame abroad was a couple of years ago at TGS, we had a full-size pirate ship as our stand. And that's all we had. There's no games to play. Just like, check out our pirate ship. We can do this if we want. And some cosplayers, obviously. But we haven't actually had a booth at TGS since, because what do you do after you've had a full-size pirate ship? There's nothing left to do. And here, it's just Grand Blue Fantasy. We just completely took over Shibuya about 6 months ago. Anything that could be advertised in Shibuya for several weeks was nothing but Grand Blue Fantasy. Even the stairs in the station had been completely just printed with Grand Blue Fantasy stuff. It was quite insane. Probably cost a lot of money. And speaking of money, this is a look at sales. I'm not sure how clearly you can see it, but we're actually a part of the Cyber Agent group, which is very much, again, a group that maybe 7 years ago nobody had heard of. But thanks to Cygames in no small part, we contribute a large portion of the revenues to Cyber Agent. But they've also got like Ameba TV, which is a streaming TV service in Japan. It's kind of like a live Netflix, which has just got millions and millions of people watching it every day. And a lot of our other revenue comes from ad-based services. But you can see that we're almost on the par with Bandai Namco these days, which is pretty impressive because those guys have just got cackloads of IP. And it's not many companies that can actually come out with repeated hit IP, not just in Japan, but anybody in the mobile game space these days. So props to us, thank you very much. So a little bit of a talk about Shadowverse. As I said, might not be able to tell too well from these images, but yeah, it's a turn-based card game. We take very high pride in our art. We've got one entire floor with just hundreds and hundreds of Japan's best illustrators just churning out extremely detailed card art for all of our games. Now, obviously, it does have quite a Japanese aesthetic, and that's part of what made it such a big hit domestically and provides a point of differentiation, I guess, overseas. So next, I'm just going to do an extremely brief video of the game. It's so brief that it's actually shorter than my explanation of the brief video of the game.
You're done for.
That was quick. Might make a longer one of those someday. So taking a quick look at some KPIs of the game, 10 million downloads, 1 million daily active users. Obviously that changes. Sometimes it's more. Actually, it's almost, I think I've only seen one day where it's less since the launch window. But especially because most of those are from Japan. We've got like almost 100. 1 in 100 Japanese people is playing this game on a daily basis. So if you go to Japan and just look at people's phones, you're almost guaranteed to see it sooner or later. Every day, more than 4 million battles are taking place. Each battle takes about 10 to 15 minutes, so that's like an average playtime of an hour per user. Extremely high engagement on the game, and again, other ridiculously good KPIs, which I'm not allowed to tell you about. It's too bad. And we're also pushing it very hard for esports. And just to give one figure, we had 222,000 total page views for a recent broadcast we had of a Japan versus Korea invitational tournament, which I'm sure, League of Legends and stuff like that can beat those numbers, but considering that we've only been around for a year and most of those viewers are Japan, we consider them to be quite impressive. You'll notice that the there are, in Japan, it's not just Twitch. In fact, Twitch doesn't have much of a market share there yet. So we're using YouTube Live, OpenRec. We've also tried things like Ameba TV by our partner group. There's all kinds of platforms trying to battle it out to be the streaming service of choice these days. So not really your problem, but it's just bearing in mind that you can't expect dominance on Twitch as you can perhaps in the West. So why do we do esports? Quite simply, the important people at the company really love it, as do a lot of the staff. We even have our own Magic the Gathering pro team, which includes one of the best Magic the Gathering players of all time, Yuya Watanabe, and some other really good guys. And of course, they inform a lot of the game design of the game. Back in GDC, we announced our new Street Fighter fighting team, Cygames Beast, including Daigo Umehara, the most famous Street Fighter player ever. Snake Eyes and PR Balrog are also in that team. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about our collaborations with the company Rage in Japan to do Shadowverse tournaments. And here's just a couple of photos of those extremely dark photos, so sorry that you can't really make out what's going on there, but basically these very dark people are going wild with excitement from how much they're enjoying the match that's taking place on the screen. This particular broadcast had over 400,000 viewers for the grand final. And recently we announced that we're building towards doing a global invitational by the end of the year, so Europeans, North Americans, Taiwanese and Koreans are going to be invited to Tokyo for another grand broadcast where we're expected to break those figures once again. And just to show you that I'm not lying and it is cool, I'm going to play another brief video, which we actually put on real Japanese TV in Japan that people see on a daily basis that promotes this tournament. Oh, it's over. Okay, that was cool, wasn't it? Yes. Yeah. Sorry you couldn't read the Japanese in it. It was just saying, wow, cool, esports. And everybody loves it. So I want to look at a few KPIs in right now of esports in Japan, which kind of outlines, I guess, the risk of actually when we took on this project. Because esports in Japan actually isn't that big. I got these numbers from the esports earnings website. I'm sure they don't have 100% of the numbers, but I think it's pretty indicative. If you look at prize winning especially, you don't really see many Japanese athletes out there winning the big money. And looking at the cumulative pool, Japan barely scrapes it to like 30th place, right behind a lot of much smaller Asian countries like Malaysia and so on. And again, if you look at the individual athletes, while someone like Daigo Umehara might be one of the most visible and recognizable esports athletes in the world, if you go through the table, you have to go down to the mid-400s until you start seeing the earnings of Japanese players. That's massively dwarfed by the players of the Western titles like League of Legends and Counter-Strike Go and whatnot. So why could this be? Why aren't people in Japan going crazy for esports like everyone else is? Why aren't they getting up there winning titles? Because we all know Japan's a big market, heaps of game players, they spend lots of money. You'd expect them to be high up in these tables, right? So I want to talk a little bit about maybe some of the cultural, political, and so on roots that might affect some of this. One of them, I think, just Japan has a different philosophical base compared to Western countries. They do come from a Confucian background. It's not so much about being lucky and being chosen by God and going to heaven. It's more about just taking pride in your work, in your family values, in your community values and stuff like that. They're expected to struggle in their life. And yeah, I think the fact that they don't expect to be lucky is perhaps one of the major things. And in Japanese, there's not a common translation for good luck. It's like when you're about to do a test or go to do sports or something like that, they don't say good luck, they say do your best. I think that says a lot about their mentality. Next one, Japanese did some naughty things and ended up losing a war. And part of their constitution after the war was that they're not allowed to have an army. And this, this was a long time ago now, a good 80 years ago, but they've really taken it to heart. And a lot of them are very proud about this pacifist stance. And even though the current government is quite hawkish and trying to get the army going again, you can see videos of how passionately people protested and other politicians tried to protest this decision going through. And I think this is one of the things that separates perhaps Japan from China and Korea and other countries in the West. And often you'll see them playing sports and they don't often actually win global sports. They seem to lack that winning mentality of actually really desperately wanting to beat the other guy. Because in Japan, you don't want to seek out aggression or confrontation. You want everybody to be happy. And I think for a lot of athletes, that mentality kicks in just at the wrong time when actually you just want to be focused on winning the match, which is quite awkward in something like esports. Next one I want to talk about is a sense of community. How many of you guys have been to Japan? Good, well done. Did any of you see like a Matsuri or a Japanese festival while you were there? Nobody? Oh, you have to go again. I'll pay for your flight, come see me later. Just a joke. Maybe if you win the raffle, we'll see. So yes, Japan, especially in the summer, there are lots and lots of festivals going all across the country. There's winter festivals, harvest festivals. All of their days off are based around either things to do with people or nature. They're not about deities and stuff like that. And it's quite incredible living there, just seeing how important community aspects are for them. Also, these festivals have been around for, I don't know, at least hundreds of years, maybe thousands. I can't really say. Of course, we've had them in the West as well, but I think they've mostly really dropped off in the West, but they've really persevered in Japan. And Japan's done a lot of interesting things to keep them going, and they seriously invest in it. And, one of those, as an example, is after the war, when Japan was really, really poor, the government made a big effort to promote domestic tourism. So they got all of the different regions and towns to try and focus on why is your town famous? Like, what's your town famous for? Is it famous for like ostrich ramen, or is it famous for like something that doesn't even exist, like a fairy tale or something like that? So every town in Japan has something that it's famous for, and you guarantee that if you go to that town, people are going to be proud about it and tell you about it. And this really seeps through into those Matsuris and other events like that. I think that even reflects, if you go to somewhere like Tokyo and Harajuku and you see people wearing all the crazy clothes, it's like the Japanese have done a great job of making sure that there's a community for everything. So even if your specific taste in clothes is you only wear white on the right side and the left side is polka dots, it's like there's probably a community for it somewhere. And there's probably a community for your games. They're really good at seeking out communities, and they call them circles because they do them at school. At university, they're pushed into these circles as well. In the office, they've got circles. They're always creating these community groups. I think a lot of it comes from this history of finding something communal to do with the people around you. So I want to talk a little bit about how we've tried to introduce some of this Matsuri culture into our title. One thing that we did recently, just about 2 or 3 months ago, I think. So the game had only been out about 9 months. So it's quite hard to say when you do something for the first time on a new title how successful it's going to be. But we really made a massive effort for the Shadowverse Festival. We rented out 2 halls from the Makuhari Messe, which is the same place where Tokyo Game Show is. And I think they only use about 6 halls, so it's about a third of the size of Tokyo Game Show. And we managed to get over nearly 15,000 people to attend the 2-day event. We had a 1,500 simultaneous tournament going on. So all of these people there are actually playing Shadowverse against each other. And it ended in just like 2 people playing each other on the stage. We had heaps of cosplayers. We had heaps and heaps of merchandise. Like, we make so much merchandise you would not believe. You can see the little black square in the middle on the left. That's a bunch of different influencers, I guess. Like, they're not on YouTube, they're on Nico Nico Dorga and stuff like that, and equivalent Japanese influencer channels. Had a bunch of them. So there was something for everyone to do. So lots of people were bringing their girlfriends, their families, and they all came in groups too. Like, one of the things we did really well was this massive tournament that we had. It's not, sorry, I actually said 1-on-1, but that was a lie. I'm sorry about that. It was actually groups of 3, so it was 3 versus 3 for each of those. So you couldn't take part in the contest unless you brought 2 friends along with you. So instead of being a lonely train journey out to the Makuhari Messe by yourself to maybe engage with other fans of the game, but you're shy, so you don't know, you'd have to find a couple of friends to bring with you, and then suddenly it's a day out with your mates rather than just a solo pursuit. Another thing that we've been doing pretty much since the start is in-store support. By that I mean we support real-life stores like, I don't know, Games Workshop or WH Smith's or a convenience store, whatever. Any real-life store that wants to do their own Shadowverse tournament, they can apply to us and we'll give them a bunch of free swag to give as prizes. So we've got all these promo cards you see on the right. We make a new bunch of them every time there's a card expansion, so that's every 3 months. And if you go on eBay, like, they'll go for like 20 to 50 bucks or 100 for some of the older ones. So the fans love them and they really go after them. They're really high quality. The square thing on the left, that's like a battery pack for charging your smartphone. So, you know, they're worth like 10, 15 quid. They're pretty valuable stuff, and we don't get any money out of these tournaments. It's just about engaging our users and, more importantly, trying to get them to meet each other in real life. Trying to drive them away from it just being a lonely single-player pursuit to actually somewhere where you make friends and then it really becomes a part of your life instead of just a game. And you can see, I think that's quite a lot of tournaments to be happening in Japan every single week. And we're looking to roll this out in some other countries soon as well. So I'm not sure if you guys have been to esports talks before, but every time there's an esports talk, there's always a pyramid. So I wanted to have a pyramid as well. So if you look at the blue part, and you've got your mass of regular players, like the 10 million people who've downloaded the game, playing the game there. Obviously, they make up the majority of the game. But the goal is to rise them up the pyramid so that they become more and more invested in the game emotionally, and eventually financially, we hope as well, of course. So doing what we can to support those community-run tournaments by supporting offline and online events. Of course, we also support official online open tournaments. We've got, I think it's 4 of those every week take part in Japan. And I run the Western ones as well, so they're happening all over the place. They're in Korea, Taiwan as well. And then we got the regional circuits. So this is part of our ongoing plans, is to have what's the best event in Europe, what's the best event in America, and then bring them all together for the global finals at the end. And this isn't really so different to any other esports title. So I think what really makes Cygames different, and like specifically from their experience making games like Grand Blue Fantasy and Rage of Bahamut, is how much they focus on these chunky orange arrows on the side, the in-game events and the real-world events. So I still don't think Western game developers are doing a great job compared to Japan of doing in-game events, and by that I mean limited time events that users get really excited about. It's like, oh, I've only got 2 weeks to get this rare character or experience this part of the story that's going to disappear after that. Like, Grand Blue Fantasy is all about that. Like, you can play it in English if you can find a way to download it. And if you can get through the brutal turn-based Japanese RPG style of the game, lots of people do and love it, then you'll see that it's just a tremendous amount of depth that comes from these in-game events. And then on the Shadowverse side, we're really pushing the real-world events, things like the Shadowverse Festival, the Rage tournaments, the in-store support, things like that. By having these twin channels of, I guess, content, live content, changing content, real-life content, that's what helps your users really bubble up to the top. And I think it's almost come out of necessity for us, because Japanese gamers are so shy about being competitive that they're not so many of them are going to rise to the top unless you really encourage them by doing these kind of things. So it does take a lot of money, and I know you guys are all busy making video games, and I know the temptation. I've been there. Just making the game awesome is already such a hard thing. It's very tempting to just say, I'll just make the game awesome, and the marketing team will take care of everything else. But one of the things that I think makes Cygames different is everybody is involved in these. Like, everybody worked at Shadowverse Festival. Everybody came up with ideas for what to do there. A lot of the people on the team are long-term card game fans, or even ex-pros. So they've been going to Magic the Gathering events for decades, and they're always like, oh, we've got to do more of these offline events, or people love real card sleeves, so we've got to make some of those, or we want rubber mats for playing Magic on, let's make Shadowverse ones. All of these ideas for merchandise and events are coming from inside the team, and nothing's more disappointing than loving a video game and then you go to their official store and all they've got is mugs. It's like, oh great, more mugs and some pens. It's like, you want to have merchandise that comes from the root of what is interesting about that game. And I think that's when people go crazy for it. Like, at the Shadowverse Festival, we were selling alarm clocks that just had the voice of one of the characters inside it. And the character's called the bell ringer angel, so she's like carrying bells like this, and she goes ding dong whenever you play the card. And we made like 10,000 of them, and they all just sold out in a couple of days. It's like, if you can make a product that really identifies with something from inside of the game and outside of the game, then people are going to go crazy for it. Of course, the third point here, I'm assuming that you're going to make an awesome game. Right? You can't just make a halfway game and then tag esports on it and it's going to be amazing. You really have to make a game that somebody will love. And Shadowverse is exactly that. So good job, us. So I've talked a bit about the differences with like Japanese esports and gamers there, but it's not all different. We do face some of the same challenges that people in the West do. You still need to make sure that being a part of that game is an interesting story. It's not just some mechanical interaction with gacha at the end of it. There needs to be some emotional pull throughout the thing. One of the biggest challenges for us that we all get them with gamers, I think Brits as well suffer from it a little bit, is how to make nerds flamboyant and charismatic. It can be a really big challenge. And if any of you guys watch like EVO, the fighting challenge, fighting tournament in Las Vegas every year, like, you'll always get a bunch of Japanese finalists, but they're all so polite, so shy. They have to be trained how to smack talk each other. And even when they smack talk, they're extremely polite about it. It's like, yes, I'm definitely not going to lose to you today. And everyone's like, oh, great. So, yeah, how do we get them really sparking is a challenge, especially in a card game where you're staring down a lot of the time. It was interesting recently when we had the Korea versus Japan match, and just the Japanese players were just sat there like rocks the entire contest, whilst the Korean players were like, they're like totally overreacting. They were counting their fingers. It was a lot more visually interesting to watch. So it's a challenge, and a lot of the time there's not much you can do about it, but we're still trying. And of course, the ultimate goal, which I talked about in the pyramid, how to make your regular players into competitive ones. Because once they do, they're hyper engaged and they're there to stay. So what are some of these challenges that we share? So we need to take these gamers, and these people are so spoiled for choice. There's dozens of games coming out every week. They're all super high quality now. Why are they not only going to play your game, but actually make it their hobby, that they're going to stick around and play for years? And I think another thing is, like, how can you make it more inclusive to non-esports fans? So I spoke about, like, the Shadowverse Festival had all the cosplayers there, and there was shopping to be done, and there was, like, not just cosplay, but we had, like, a giant guy in a, like, soft toy suit. The kids loved that one. It was great. So what are we doing to really make it not just a super hardcore? And when I watch a lot of Western esports events, I really feel that it's hyper hardcore. So yeah, try and make it more soft and welcoming, and don't just focus on the video game. So I've already come up to my takeaway points with quite a bit of time to spare, but that's good. I'm sure you're all tired just like me. So I want everyone to think today about what can you really do to encourage your users to actually not just play the game inside the game, but actually play it in other places too. What are you putting out there so that they're going and playing with their friends or meeting new people, getting away from their PC or their sofa or whatever? What can they do with your product that isn't purely digital? What's happening out there in the real world? It's not just, it's about events, it's about merchandise. Try and make your product physically exist in the world, and suddenly it seems more socially viable to them somehow. So encouraging friends to come, things for families to engage with, really push for merchandise that even you would pay money for, even if you're on the dev team. Think hard about that. What would you want that much? My final tip is, try and come up with some ways to try and encourage those local esports events by providing support packages. Even if it's just virtual ones, that's cool. But once you can start making real physical prizes, that really, it's so much difference. We were just promoting the game in France recently, and people had never played the game, but once they saw that there were free promotional packs, they would just line up again and again to get it. By the end of it, they're hooked. People want real stuff, and they're paying money for not real stuff. But once they love your real stuff, they might pay money for the not real stuff, and then everybody wins. And on that illogical point, I'm going to finish the presentation. And you're welcome to ask me as many questions as you like, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much. Yes. Oh, would you mind using the microphone?
Hey. You're talking about events where you kind of get the whole family involved in Japan. Have you found the same, being able to do the same in the West as well?
For us right now, the Western is definitely the next big challenge. It's a lot more difficult because Japan's super compact, which makes it really easy to do these things. You can just target specific cities and people just come together. But obviously America's our next biggest market, but it's so spread out. Even LA is a massively spread out place. Where do you bring them all together? So it's kind of, I would say the next challenge for us is how do we recreate that? So I just spoke about a recent booth in the Japan Expo in Paris, and I think currently our current plan is actually get to those events where people have similar passions. So obviously in that place there's a lot of people passionate about Japanese content, and we have really really high quality Japanese art, Japanese voice actors, stuff like that in the game. So people are naturally drawn to the booth. And as they become more engaged with the game over time, then we're really hoping that we can provide that kind of example layer of content at those events, and then eventually the community will replicate them. We have had some like individual stores reach out and say, oh, we want to play your game at your store. Can you provide us with goodies? But yeah, it's a lot more challenging out here. So I would say kind of scale it to what your DAU is at the time. Obviously our DAU in the West isn't as big as it is in Japan right now, but as that grows, we'll definitely be looking to replicate more of those in the West. Thank you. Next.
Thank you. Kind of on that point as well, with getting the family involved and people who maybe aren't gamers or not interested in games at all involved, can you go a little more into depth as to the kinds of things that you had set up at the event for those people?
Yes, so not just Shadowverse, but Grand Blue Fantasy as well has quite a rich real-world calendar, and again uses a lot of famous composers for the game. So immediately that brings in people who might not be interested in the gameplay, just the gameplay, but also like that specific composer. And Nobuo Uematsu, is that the one, I believe? So we've actually done like orchestra events in Shibuya where they'll play through the whole like repertoire of Grand Blue Fantasy music with a full orchestra. And yeah, heaps of people, thousands of people went to that, and it really brought a much more mixed layer to the game. Other than that, then, yeah, there was the stuff we did at Shadowverse Festival. Obviously, we use a lot of cosplay, but it's hard to say how far that will go in the West. I definitely notice people always turn their heads when somebody in a cool costume walks past, so that's definitely one thing I would push a bit. I'm not so sure about the UK, but it feels like in America, France, and some other countries, like cosplay is becoming a lot bigger these days. So that could be one more thing. I'll have a think about the rest. You can ask me later.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any others?
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I just wanted to say I'm currently running local tournaments of my video game at events and shows whenever I expo. How would you advise someone to to go about taking that to the next level?
Obviously, it depends. Yep. Cool. It depends on the size of your game and how you project it growing and how much of a risk you want to take. Obviously, we've got quite a large inventory, so we can take pretty large risks. But I would definitely try and, at your next expo, just try and get a little bit more of that festival spirit in it by having stuff like just having a small stage and just having events there with I'm not sure what kind of game it is.
So the game is Block Ships. It's the illegitimate love child of Space Invaders and Tetris. 4-person local multiplayer battle arena game. Where you build the biggest ship out of blocks and have a blast.
That sounds like great fun. Where can I download it?
It's available on Steam.
Oh, great.
Or at Play It Develop.
Yep. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of room there to have a really fun booth design, for example, that's very inclusive, and maybe even you could just have something like a block pit where kids can just come and play and throw around blocks and stuff like that. And that might pull in some parents, and then they can just play the game whilst the kids are suffocating in the block pit and stuff like that and giving you legal problems. Yeah, so obviously our game is much more focused on less like real time and more super strategic thinking. So ours is, there's a lot of having people on stage talking about, well, what cards are you going to pick next and something like that. So I guess in your case, it's more about how the flow of the game has drastic reversals and exciting moments like that. So definitely try and get some very charismatic announcer to just talk, like be very loud, talk in the game, and just have people being like, what's all that fuss about? But maybe these are things you've tried already, so feel free to chat with me later and can find out get a feeling for what you've done so far and what might be still to explore. Thanks. Any more? You're also welcome to ask me just generic questions about Japanese game development, if you so please. No, it's a bit boring, isn't it? No, there's one more, sure.
So you're talking about how in the West, a lot of these tournaments are like really core players and things like that. And I'm thinking one of the points is that developers are really honing in on their personas and trying to get those really core players and get the right people playing the game. So when you say you're trying to bring in those casual users, is your expectation that they will become core users, or that they're just sort of filling in the community kind of thing? You know what I mean?
Usually they do just fill in the community. Like when you look at the people who actually win our tournaments, they're almost carbon copies of each other. So they're all extremely focused, smart, and usually, not very flamboyant people, but it's the other people who form the community underneath that make it exciting. Like the people who do cosplay for the game, and like even in a recent expo in LA, we had people who did like Shadowverse cosplay. And it's people like that make the game fun, and if you're the boyfriend who's playing it till 3 a.m. annoying his girlfriend, at least it legitimizes it a little bit. If you have some of those other, okay, I'm not going to play it till 3 a.m., but I dig the character art and the music, and I like the cosplayers that they have at the event, so sure, I'll attend. There might be something cool to do. Yes. Can you just take the microphone, please?
Thank you. There's a sketch show called Key and Peele, and in that they have President Obama, and he's very mild-mannered and he can't say what he wants, so he brings out this guy called his anger translator. I was wondering, with what you were saying about people's reticence to be really flamboyant, you could, and needing to make it interesting for viewers, could you almost have, especially with even Japanese pro sports stars aren't particularly flamboyant, right? So, but what they actually do on pitch is interesting. So with an esport thing, could you have almost like hype men behind the two champions, smack talking each other? You could get celebrities to do that, because then at least that would make interesting TV, right? Interesting viewing.
Absolutely, yeah. That's all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes. Right? I remember as a student, I went on some American talk show. Oh, I'm out of time. This is such a good story. Tell it. Who's the most famous American talk show host? The guy who made everybody argue with each other. Jerry Springer. Yes, that's the one. So I was on that, and it was a really boring edition. Like nobody was fighting. So there's a guy behind the stage who would just like whip us up into a fury about it. He'd be going like and stuff like that. And a lot of those things you need to get them going in esports too. And at Shadowverse, we pass around those like baton things for free. And at Japanese sport events, they'll almost always give you some kind of toy to wave or make noise with and stuff like that. There's a lot to say for props in esports and esports in general, I guess. With that, it looks like I'm out of time. I will be here for a few days, so if you were too shy to ask but you still want to talk, feel free to approach me. Thank you very much for your time.